During Sunday's service, the churchroom buzzed with whispers and hymns, a typically peaceful morning. Officer Carlson, in his crisp uniform, was an unexpected guest sitting quietly in the back. 3-year-old Jamie, curious and unassuming, tumbled over to him and tugged at his sleeve to share a seemingly innocent secret. The officer's expression changed from calm to shocked, as Jamie's words led to an immediate, unexpected arrest. "Field," Officer Carlson said, quietly but firmly, as he squatted next to the bench Jamie's father was sitting on. Mark looked up in shock and was surprised to see his son in the officer's arms. "Come with me," Officer Carlson whispered, and Mark stood up quietly. Outside, he reached out to take his child from the officer, but instead, a pair of cold handcuffs snapped together around his wrists. "What happens?" Mark asked, confused, as he tried to pull his hands out of the handcuffs. "Your son said something I simply cannot ignore," Officer Carlton said, as he handed Jamie over to a female officer. He saw the shock on Mark's face when he heard his son had something to do with it, and he started to defend himself. "He's just a kid." Officer Carlton sighed as he shook his head and turned towards the church door. He swung them open, and Mark heard the shocked gasps from all the churchgoers as Officer Carlton ordered them outside. "Pastor Benjamin, you are coming with me." But what did Jamie say to the officer? What does his father have to do with it? And why has the priest been arrested? Mark sat in the police car and looked at his son through the window. He didn't even know how his son had gotten into the church, because he hadn't taken him to the service himself. However, he knew where he had to be. He just didn't know where he had made such a fool of himself. And now he was about to be arrested, and it was all his own fault. His wife, Lillian, arrived at the church, confused to see her husband in the back seat of a police car and her son in the arms of an officer. She quickly cradled her son, who wasn't upset at all, and asked the officer what the heck was going on. "I can't go into detail," the female officer said, as Officer Carlton stepped out of the church with the priest in handcuffs in front of him. It shocked Lillian even more, because her family had always been good friends with the priest. "Pastor Benjamin? What is this?" she stammered, but the priest was too ashamed to look at her. "Are you his mother?" Officer Carlton asked, pointing at Jamie. Lillian nodded silently, dreading what Officer Carlton would say next. "He's going to the station, too. He's only 3. Lillian tried, but Officer Carlton had made up his mind. "He may be 3 years old, but he is the reason his father has been arrested," he replied firmly. Lillian was stunned. What on earth could her son have to do with it? She looked at her little boy, who was smiling innocently back at her, and she couldn't help but feel incredibly worried. Pastor Benjamin was put into the female police officer's car, and both he and Mark were driven to the police station. Lillian drove behind the 2 police cars as she wondered why her husband had been arrested. "Jamie, honey, what did you say to the police officer?" she tried to ask, but her son was already passed out in his car seat. Arriving at the police station, she gently woke Jamie up and entered. "I'm here because of Officer Carlton," Lillian said nervously to the receptionist. She led the way, and Lillian walked through the station with her heart pounding in her chest. "Daddy and the Reverend are making the kids stay at church," Jamie said suddenly, startling his mother. "What did you say, honey?" she asked, hoping she had heard wrong. But Jamie's attention was already elsewhere. Lillian gasped at the thought of her son's last words. She hoped to God he hadn't told the police officer exactly that, because it could mean so many things, some worse than others. She knocked gently on the door with Officer Carlton's name on it, stepped in, and closed the door behind her. It almost felt like she was sent into the principal's office. Officer Carlton pointedly asked Lillian if she had noticed anything suspicious about her husband. Lillian blinked, surprised by the question. "Suspicious? Mark?" she stuttered, shaking her head. "No, nothing like that." She looked at Jamie, who was sitting tinkering with a toy car. The officer's sharp gaze made her uncomfortable, and she wondered what Mark could have done to warrant this kind of scrutiny. Lillian hadn't noticed anything suspicious, and started asking her own questions to find out what was going on. "What exactly did Jamie say?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. Officer Carlton's face remained stoic. "It's part of an ongoing investigation," he replied. "I can't disclose details at this time." Frustration bubbled up inside her, but she forced herself to remain calm, hoping for some clarity. Officer Carlton continued to respond vaguely, keeping Lillian in suspense. "Is Mark in serious trouble?" she asked, trying to keep her composure. "We'll know more soon," was his only reply. Each vague answer increased her anxiety. She felt like she was running in circles, unable to understand what was going on. Jamie's innocent babble was the only sound that broke the tense silence. Officer Carlton turned his attention to Jamie and began asking him questions. "Jamie, can you tell me about the church?" he asked cautiously. Jamie looked up and was distracted by the shiny badge on the officer's chest. "There were toys," he said, twisting a lock of his hair. Lillian looked at him nervously, hoping her son wouldn't say anything to make things worse. "And humans," Jamie added, his attention drifting again. Jamie didn't really feel like listening or sitting still, which made questioning difficult. "Jamie, did you see anything strange?" Officer Carlton tried again, but Jamie was more interested in the buttons on his own shirt than in answering questions. He squirmed in his seat and giggled as he played with his toy car. Lillian sighed, feeling the tension in the room rise. She knew this would not lead to anything productive. Lillian began to lose patience and told Officer Carlton that she wanted to take her husband home. "This is ridiculous," she snarled. "Mark is not a criminal. I'll take him home." She stood up and reached for her son. Officer Carlton held up a hand to stop her. "Mrs. Green, I'm begging you. We're not done here," he said in a firm but calm tone. Lillian's frustration grew, and she could feel her temper flare. Officer Carlton said his team was busy gathering evidence as they spoke. "We are in the process of gathering important information," he explained, trying to sound reasonable. Lillian narrowed her eyes. She was not convinced. "Evidence of what?" she asked. "You haven't told me anything." Jamie tugged on her sleeve, sensing the tension. "I'm begging you, Mrs. Green," insisted Officer Carlton. "We just need a little more time to sort this out." Lillian felt angry and frustrated by Officer Carlton's defensive and vague attitude. "This is absurd," she muttered. "You're not telling me anything useful." She looked at Jamie, who was starting to look sleepy. "I need answers, not excuses," she said, her voice rising slightly. Officer Carlton remained calm, but his silence only fueled her anger. She felt like she was hitting a wall. She stormed out of the station and went back to the church to find her own answers. "Come on, Jamie," she said, lifting him up. "We have to go." The receptionist looked up in surprise as Lillian marched past with quick and determined steps. She didn't know what she would find in the church, but she couldn't just sit and wait. Her thoughts revolved around the possibilities as she drove. Before arriving at the church, she stopped by her parents' house to drop Jamie off. "Mom, Dad, can you look after Jamie for a bit?" she asked quickly. Her parents exchanged worried glances, but nodded. "Of course, honey," her mother said, taking Jamie's hand. "Be nice to Grandma and Grandpa," Lillian told Jamie, kissing his forehead. She quickly got back into the car, feeling the urgency. When she arrived at the church, she found it cordoned off with yellow crime scene tape and swarming with police. Lillian's heart sank as she parked her car. There were officers everywhere, talking on the radio and taking notes. She took a deep breath and tried to calm her nerves. She had to get in, but she had to do it smartly. Determined, she went to the nearest officer, hoping to find a way inside. She decided to play her innocent female role and asked an officer if she could go inside. "Excuse me," she said softly, trying to look as harmless as possible. "I think I forgot something important inside during the service this morning." The officer looked at her skeptically, but didn't dismiss her right away. "It's really important," she added, sending him a pleading look. She hoped her acting was convincing. She said she had lost her wedding ring during the service this morning. The officer raised an eyebrow. "Your wedding ring?" he repeated. Lillian nodded vigorously, holding up her bare hand for emphasis. "I must have dropped it somewhere in the Great Hall," she explained. "I just need a few minutes to look for it. Please." Her voice was calm, but inside she was shaking with anxiety. After giving her some extra feminine charm, the officer let her in, but told her to hurry. "All right, ma'am, but do it quickly," he said, stepping aside. "Thank you very much," said Lillian, who flashed a grateful smile. She walked past him, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't believe it had actually worked. Now she had to make the most of this opportunity. Lillian wanted more than just to look around the Great Hall, but she said nothing. She walked purposefully towards the benches, trying to appear focused on her supposed quest. Her mind was filled with questions and possibilities. She had to find something, anything, that would help her understand why Mark and Pastor Benjamin had been arrested. But first she had to continue acting. At first she pretended to search the benches as she felt the officer's eyes on her. Lillian moved slowly, lifting hymnals and looking under the pillows, making a number out of it. She could feel the officer's gaze following her every move. Her mind raced as she planned her next steps. She had to distract him just for a moment. She hoped he would soon lose interest and look away. As soon as he was distracted, she sprinted towards the cellar door. The officer turned to speak to a colleague, and Lillian jumped at the chance. She hurried across the hall, her footsteps echoing in the empty room. Her heart pounded in her ears as she reached the door. She quickly looked back and was relieved to see that the officer was still engaged in conversation. She had never been down there, but knew that every church had its own aisles. Lillian hesitated briefly before pushing open the door. The stairs leading down were dimly lit, and not very inviting. She took a deep breath and descended, her hand sliding along the cool, damp railing. She hoped her instincts were right, and that she would find something useful underneath. She thought that if someone wanted to hide something in a church, it must be down there. The basement seemed like the perfect place for secrets. She moved carefully as her eyes adjusted to the dim light. Shadows danced on the walls as she navigated the narrow corridors. Each step echoed, heightening her sense of urgency. She had to find whatever it was before the officer noticed her absence. She hurried down the hall, knowing that the officer might notice her absence at any moment. The further she walked, the darker it became. Her breathing quickened, and she held onto her phone tightly, using its light to find her way. She could hear faint sounds from above, reminding her that she didn't have much time. She continued, determined to find out what was hiding down here. It was dark, damp, and cold, deep down in the church, and Lillian's heart was pounding. She shivered and wrapped her arms around herself as she ventured further in. The faint smell of mold filled the air, and her footsteps echoed eerily. Every creak and distant sound made her flinch, but she continued, driven by the need to find answers. Her nerves were on edge, but she couldn't turn back now. Finally, she found her first door, which was thick and made of wood. It looked old and heavy, with iron hinges rusted from years of neglect. Lillian hesitated as her hand hovered over the doorknob. She took a deep breath and pushed it up as the tree groaned in protest. The door creaked loudly, and she shuddered at the sound, hoping it wouldn't attract too much attention. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but dust and boxes in the room. Lillian's heart sank as she entered. Cobwebs hung in the corners, and the air was thick with dust. She rummaged through the boxes quickly, but they contained only old church articles and forgotten things. Frustrated, she wiped her hands on her jeans and went back to the hallway. She quickly moved on and heard the police officer's voice calling over her. She panicked when she realized they were looking for her. "Mrs. Green!" the voice called, echoing down the stairs. She quickened her pace, her footsteps soft on the cold stone floor. She had to be ahead of them and find something useful before they caught up with her. She continued to search even as the officer called out to her. "Lillian, come back!" His voice came closer. Her pulse quickened as she rounded a corner, desperate to find another door, another trail. She couldn't afford to stop now. Every second counted. Ignoring the fear bubbling up inside her, she focused on her goal. She didn't want to leave the place without an answer. Police officers had entered the halls to look for Lillian. She could hear their heavy footsteps coming closer. Their voices bounced off the walls, getting louder with each passing second. "She's down here somewhere!" shouted one of them. Lillian's heart pounded in her chest, but she pushed forward, determined not to be caught before she found what she was looking for. Lillian was far ahead of them, still searching for answers. She moved quickly and quietly as her eyes scanned the dimly lit corridor. Every door she passed she considered opening, but there was no time to check them all. She had to trust her instincts. The police officers' voices fell slightly, giving her a small sense of relief. Suddenly, she heard what sounded like children crying in the distance. The faint, heartbreaking sobs stopped her in her tracks. Her breath caught in her throat as she strained to listen. Could it be true? She followed the sound, her pace quickening. The screams grew louder and led her deeper into the halls. She felt a surge of hope and fear. She rushed over there, hoping to find some clues. The hallway twisted and turned, but she kept moving, driven by the desperate sounds. She reached a heavy wooden door at the end of the hall. Her hands shook as she reached for the handle. "It must be here," she whispered to herself, praying she was right. She took a deep breath and turned the handle. Just as she reached the door, the police behind her shouted for her to put her hands up. "Stand still! Put your hands up so we can see them!" The sudden shout made her jump. She spun around, and her hands went up instinctively. The officers were closer than she had thought, their flashlights blinding her. She looked back at the door, her heart sinking, and she knew that time was running out on her. The police officers escorted Lillian out of the church and into a police car. Her hands were handcuffed behind her back, and she walked with her forehead held high despite the situation. The officer's grip was firm, but not hard. As they led her to the car, she caught a glimpse of curious onlookers whose whispers filled the air. She remained calm and determined not to show fear. They took her to the station where Mark saw her through a glass window. He was sitting in an interrogation room, and his heart sank when he saw Lillian being led away in handcuffs. She glanced at him briefly, her eyes filled with a mixture of determination and concern. Mark's stomach turned as he realized how serious things had become. He couldn't understand why they had brought her in. Mark's eyes widened in shock as he saw his wife being brought in handcuffed. "Lillian," he murmured through the glass, but she could not answer. The officer escorting her kept a firm grip on her arm and led her into another room. Mark's mind raced with questions and fears. How had things gotten out of hand so quickly? He felt helpless, unable to do anything for his wife. Officer Carlton entered Mark's room and began questioning him. "Mark, we need to talk," he said, sitting down across from him. Mark stared at him, his hands clenched into fists. "Why is my wife here? What's going on?" he demanded. Carlton ignored his question and flipped through a notebook. "Let's start from the beginning," he said, his tone all business. "Tell me about the church." Mark first wanted to know what was going on with his wife. "I'm not saying anything until you tell me why Lillian is here," he said firmly. His voice was calm, but his eyes revealed his concern. Officer Carlton sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Mark, we're trying to piece it all together. It's complicated," he replied. But Mark wouldn't hear of it. "Tell me now," he insisted. Officer Carlton didn't want to say anything, but knew he had to give Mark something. He sighed and looked down at his notes before meeting Mark's intense gaze. "Listen, Mark," he began reluctantly. "We found Lillian in a restricted area of the church." He paused, weighing his words carefully. "We had no choice but to take her in for questioning." Mark's eyes narrowed as he sensed there was more to the story. He told Mark that his wife had been arrested inside the church, which was an active crime scene. "The church is currently under investigation," Carlton explained. "Lillian was found in a restricted area section due to the ongoing investigation." Mark's confusion grew even greater. "A crime scene?" he repeated, shaking his head. "What kind of crime?" Carlton remained tight-lipped, saying only, "We're investigating several serious cases. She shouldn't have been there." Mark began to say that it was all a big misunderstanding. "Officer, you've got it all wrong," he insisted. "Lillian would never do anything illegal. She can't possibly be involved in anything criminal. It must be a mistake." His voice was pleading, desperate for Carlton to believe him. But Carlton's expression didn't change. "We'll see," he said, writing notes in his book. Mark began to realize what might have caused his arrest. As the conversation progressed, fragments of recent events began to fall into place in his consciousness. He remembered strange conversations, unusual behavior from people in the church. He got a gasp as he connected the dots. "Oh no," he mumbled. Carlton noticed the change in Mark's demeanor and leaned in. "What's up, Mark?" he asked intensely. Officer Carlton used more intense interrogation techniques to coax details out of Mark. "You have to tell me everything you know." His voice sharpening. "Who else is involved? What were you and Lillian doing?" Mark's hands shook as he rubbed his temples and tried to think. The pressure was overwhelming. Carlton's relentless questioning pushed him to the edge. I don't know," Mark stammered, feeling trapped. Mark finally began to open up and revealed that he needed extra money. He looked down and felt ashamed. "I have struggled financially," he admitted. "The bills have piled up, and I didn't know where else to turn." Officer Carlton listened intently as he held his pen over his notebook. "So you decided to take matters into your own hands?" he asked. Mark nodded slowly, feeling the weight of his confession. Pastor Benjamin wanted to help him by starting a daycare at the church. "Benjamin suggested we start a daycare," explains Mark. "He thought it might help us both. I wanted to get the extra money I needed, and the church could give the kids a safe place to be." Mark's eyes were filled with regret. "We didn't think it would cause problems. We just wanted to help." The daycare was not approved, which created legal problems. "We didn't know we needed a license," Mark continues. We just set it up and started taking care of the kids. We thought we were doing something good." Officer Carlton was writing notes, his face a mixture of disbelief and understanding. "So you ran a daycare without a permit?" he asked. Mark nodded, feeling the gravity of their mistake. Officer Carlton was stunned by this revelation and expected a different story. He had prepared himself for something much darker. "I thought it was about something else entirely," he admitted, leaning back in his chair. The tension in the room shifted as he processed the new information. "You were just trying to help your family," he said almost to himself. "I didn't see that coming." Officer Carlton was relieved that the situation turned out to be innocent. He took a deep breath and felt his suspicions disappear. "Okay, Mark," he said, standing up. "I understand now. This changes things." Mark looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. "Does that mean we can go?" he asked cautiously. Carlton nodded slowly. "Let's see what we can do about it," he replied. He let the men go with a warning as long as they closed the daycare. "You are free to go," Officer Carlton said, his tone stern. "But the daycare must be closed immediately. There must be no more children in your care without the proper permission." Mark and Pastor Benjamin nodded vigorously and were grateful for the new chance. "Thank you, Mr. Officer," Mark said quietly, his voice filled with relief. Mark thanked the officer and promised never to do such a thing again. "I swear it was a one-time mistake," he said gravely. "We'll never do anything like that again." Officer Carlton nodded in satisfaction, but still serious. "Make sure you don't," he replied. Mark held out his hand, and Carlton gave it a firm handshake. "We just wanted to help," Mark added with sincere eyes. Carlton gave a small nod of understanding. Officer Carlton made sure they understood the gravity of the situation. "This could have ended very differently," he warned. "There's a reason it's illegal to operate a daycare without a license. You are putting the children at risk, and you must understand the seriousness of that." Mark and Pastor Benjamin listened intently, absorbing the officer's words. They both nodded, realizing how close they had come to dire consequences. Mark left the station with a mixture of relief and regret. The cool air outside hit him as he stepped out, and he took a deep breath. The past few hours had been a whirlwind, and he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. But the regret lingered, a reminder of the bad decisions he had made. He walked slowly as thoughts raced through his head of what could have been. Lillian was also allowed to go and met Mark outside the station. She ran to him with a mixture of worry and relief on her face. "Mark, what happened?" she asked, with a trembling voice. He pulled her into a tight hug, feeling the tension in her body. "It's over," he said softly. "We're going home." Lillian looked up at him, her eyes filled with questions. Mark explained everything to her and told her about the daycare situation. "It was all about money," he admitted. "Pastor Benjamin and I thought we could help each other. We didn't realize how much trouble we were getting into." Lillian listened quietly, her expression a mixture of relief and worry. "You should have told me," she said softly, squeezing his hand. Mark nodded, feeling the weight of his secrecy. Lillian was confused as to why Mark was doing something behind her back. "Why haven't you talked to me about it?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. "We're meant to be a team." Mark sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "I didn't want to worry you," he explained. "I thought I could fix it all myself." Lillian shook her head, tears welling up. "We have to face things together," she said. "We can't have secrets like that," Mark admitted. "It almost tore us apart." Lillian nodded in agreement. "We need to trust each other and talk about our problems," she said. They sat on a bench outside the station and held hands. "We'll get through this," Mark assured her. "Together." Lillian smiled, feeling a sense of renewed hope. The family returned to their routines and appreciated their new chance. Mark went back to work, and Lillian resumed her daily activities. They were more open with each other and made sure to talk about their concerns. Jamie played happily, oblivious to the recent turmoil. They appreciated the small moments and were grateful for the opportunity to move forward. Life felt more precious, and they clung to their renewed bond. Pastor Benjamin made an effort to correct his actions and regain trust. He apologized to the congregation, explained his mistake, and asked for forgiveness. "I lost sight of the right path," he admitted, "but I'm determined to make things right." He worked hard to rebuild the church's reputation, organized events in the local community, and reached out to those affected. Slowly, trust was restored, and the church became a stronger and more united place.